Hello, everyone. So, with each opportunity to speak at the conferences, you always have that a bit of anxiety, a bit of a eagerness, or a consistent thought going in your back of the head, thinking about, oh, I can add this, I can add that. Maybe I can think of this joke, I can think of that joke. And once your talk is over, then you are relieved. You are free to enjoy your rest of the conferences. This time around, after this talk, it will happen for me for the rest of the conference, which is just a one keynote, but yeah, why not? So here is my talk, The Rails Story, 2 decades of a design and decisions. Yeah. That's my Twitter handle, RTDP. It's also Ruby social handle, RTDP. It's a short form for my name, but many of my friends these days call it as a Rails through decades of pleasure, standing for RTDP. Yeah. And as we talked about it, my intro about me, I'm a digital nomad. I have been to many places. These are some of the pictures that I liked from all of my travels. There are many places I have been to in India, and Philadelphia is my 15th city in the US as well. So, and I run a company called Betacraft Technologies. We work mainly in a consulting Ruby on Rails applications. When it comes to learning new things, I find that the technical talks and the conference talk is a really good source. And I'm always look out for finding the good ideas. So the discovery, I sometimes feel that is not a problem that's been solved when it comes to finding the good technical talks that you can watch and then learn from. Which is why I created this website called as a Tech Talks. The domain is at techtalks.io. And this is how it looks. So you can go there, explore multiple talks, interesting ones. We are working on the algorithms to make sure that there are some trending talks that could come up based on what the community is currently watching at the time. Okay. And I also have the stickers. So find me after the talk for that. So with that, let's get started. The Rails story. This is more of divided into the 2 sections. First is the origins, where we have few why stories, and then apart from that, we will go into few of the general stories. The reason I feel that why is important is because many a times when you are trying to learn something, trying to understand something, or even trying to use it in day-to-day life, knowing why behind the things provides you with a better context, better understanding, which is why I feel it is important to know the why. Yeah. So the first why that we will explore is why Ruby. And for that, we will have to explore, go back in the time and understand what was the situation. So you all know this guy, right? Needs no introduction. And the time period, like this is the oldest photo that I could find of DHH on the internet. And this is the time 2003, 2004. He was working with 37 Signals, which is a consulting company. And a lot of the clients that he has were working on the PHP and Java. So all of these clients used to come with their preference for the language or a stack. And that is the reason he has to stick with the PHP and Java itself. There wasn't any alternatives. Now, both these options had their some pluses and then lots of cons. Like, for example, in case of a Java, the framework of choice back then was Apache Struts. And it had quite a lot of issues like XML help. We will talk about that in a while. And when it comes to the PHP, it was more ubiquitous and accessible. But then that accessibility came at the cost. And that cost was the structure. So the apps that were built with the PHP were difficult to maintain. There were a lot of spaghetti code. And when it comes to the business logic and HTML, both of them were intertwined. And those were the problems. So during this time, DHH was very much following the people like Martin Fowler and Dave Thomas. He used to consider them as a thought leaders back then, and he was influenced by their writings. And during these writings, many a times to explain some of the concepts, they would stick with the Ruby as a programming language of a choice. And that's how DHH got introduced to the Ruby, and that's how he started playing around with the Ruby. But then the big thing happened when Basecamp, a project that 37 Signals was building, was being built. With that, what came is, first time DHH did not had any restrictions as to which language to choose. He was free to choose whatever he wants. And with that, what he thought was, hey, there are I just took this quote as is from one of his older podcasts, that there are all these very smart people who I look up to and have learned a lot from. And if they pick Ruby when they are free to pick, then why wouldn't I give the try and a chance when I am free to pick? And that's how he decided to go for it, right? And this is a time in which he was at one of the Ruby conferences where there were about only 40, 42 people. And one of the speaker asked how many of you are actually using Ruby for professional work, or you're getting paid for writing Ruby. And there were only 2 people who said that they are doing that. And one of that was DHH. And DHH was working on the Basecamp and was getting paid for that. So those were the days. And it was so unconventional to choose a language like Ruby, but still he decided to go ahead with that. So the reason he felt that it was important for him was he felt that Ruby is an exceptional language. Again, one of the quote from his podcasts from that time, which is one that transitioned me from being a programmer who programmed to get the programs to being a programmer who programmed for the own sake of the programs. And that is important. Yeah. So I was thinking along that line, what are some of the things that I could find where the Ruby shows up its own happiness for the developers, or programmer happiness as one of the priorities. And this is an example I could find. So here is a comparison between, let's say, Python versus Ruby, wherein in Python, the example first one we will look at it is Ruby, where you are in an interactive console, you're trying out the IRB, and then you type quit, and then you can come out of it. Or if you go into the IRB admin and type exit, then you can also come back out of it. But if you try to do the same with the Python, type exit, Python knows what you're trying to do, but then it will still ask you to type exit along with the brackets to exit out of that console. So that is the difference between Python versus Ruby, wherein Ruby thinks and says that, hey, how can I help you? Versus Python is like, have you read the manual? So that is the philosophical difference between these 2 languages. And when it comes to choosing the Ruby, it is also about how does a programmer feel about it. So many a times when languages are getting designed, a lot of those get optimized for the machines. And whenever there is a choice, or whenever there is a decision that is putting a human and a machine in front of each other, a lot of times what gets chosen and optimized for is machines instead of humans. And that's why DHH felt that Ruby is a programming language that is rather optimizing for the humans, for their readability, for their happiness. And that's why he chose Ruby to build the Basecamp application. So that tells us why Ruby. The next question is then why Rails? So when building the Basecamp web application with Ruby, he realized that no tooling is available back then. A lot of things that he used to be very familiar and use with, let's say, a language like a PHP or a Java weren't available for Ruby programming language. So he had to write all of those today. And let's take an example that if you are to write a web application with Ruby without using Rails, you will at least start with something like a rake, right? Now imagine the days when the rake wasn't even there. So he built all this tooling, and then the Basecamp application got completed, and then he was enjoying quite a lot. So again, quoting him one more time, he was saying that I'm having so much fun programming in Ruby than I ever was in Java or a PHP. And it would be so awesome if the other people could also have that same experience. And that thinking led him to extract the Ruby on Rails as a framework from the Basecamp as an application. I remember listening to him in one of the podcasts, and the question that was asked to him was, what is the best way to build a framework? And it was, it's better not to try. If you go for building a framework, it won't work. But rather, if you build an application and try to extract the framework out of it, maybe that's your best way to build a good framework. Yeah? So he always considered open source to be a really good idea, and always felt obliged to contribute back. And that's how the framework got extracted out of the Basecamp code. So with that, there are a couple of things that happened. So it made it possible for the other Ruby developers to use Ruby for writing the professional code. Because otherwise, if you think, if he had all those issues of building the base tools to build a web application into Rails, then everyone else who was involved would also have to do that. So for developers to enjoy the Ruby, it wasn't possible, because if you are getting paid to write the code, you don't necessarily have the time to build the framework also along with your application. And that's why he decided to open source it so that everyone can benefit out of it. This also provided a kind of a jump start to pick the Ruby for everyone else. So this is a quote that I find very relatable at this stage of a discussion. It is something that is present in the Rails doctrine written by the DHH, which says Ruby has been designed with the principle of least surprise to the maths, of course, and the Rails has been designed with the principle of bigger smile for DHH. Yeah? And that gets into a nice story about this particular method that we have in Ruby. In Rails, to be precise, which is array.42. So it happened that once I was debugging something with an application, let's say with the transactions, and I went to the Rails console. I wanted to have a look at today's transactions. So I ran a query, got a couple of transactions into an array, and then I was trying to go through one by one. And then very easy and obvious method to go through content that is there in the array is to call array.first, array.second, array.last, array.third, fourth, right? And I was wondering, okay, how many such methods that we have available? Can I do array.99 maybe? Array.50, is it possible? So that's when I started digging deeper into this particular part. And then what I realized was it is available from array.first until array.fifth. Array.first and array.last being part of the Ruby core library itself, while array.second to array.fifth is something that is provided from the active support. And when these methods were added for the very first time into the Rails standard library, a discussion happened on Reddit. And the discussion went along the lines that why someone would make their public API so much bigger. It is not optimized. It is very bad practice to keep on writing such method, even when you have indexed way of accessing the elements from the array. So you can do array and then brackets, and then you can pass on the index like 0, 1, 2 or whatever, and then get that element. So why these methods are being written? And that is, I feel, is the philosophical difference between being too practical and machine oriented versus being on the side of the happiness. So at the end of that discussion, and when all of this went viral, DHH had created a pull request onto the Rails application saying that I have worked on it and optimized, and then only this method is what is required, which is array.42. So if you check within the Rails arrays, array.42 is a real method that actually works. And if you look into the Rails code base, it is there with a quote saying that it is for the Reddit users. Yeah. And then this is the second thing. User.find by first name, last name, and email. So for those of you who don't know what this is about, this is dynamic finders. It used to be there in the Rails. And one of the things that I really loved when I initially started, and I remember telling about this thing to the others who were not using the Rails and how cool Rails is, wherein what's happening here is basically, let's say you have a table called and there are multiple columns like first name, last name, and email. And now today, if you have to search within this, then what you would go with is user.where, and then you pass on a hash with first name, last name, and email, being the keys and whatever the values that you're looking for. But back then we had these dynamic finders, wherein what used to happen was you can build these methods, find by first name and last name and email. Okay, I missed an and there, but it could also be find by first name or last name or email, and then pass in the 3 parameters to this particular method. And the Rails will use meta programming to define this method first, and then use that method for actually executing the code that you are intending to use and doing the search. First day of this conference when DHS was speaking, and this topic came up about the dynamic finders and why it's not there. He mentioned that he tried to use it for something, and then it said that this is not available, and he realized, oh, it has been removed. And so he blamed that someone who is working on the performance might have removed it, which was Aaron. So I talked with him as well, and he said even he doesn't know who and why it got removed, but there should be good ways nowadays to handle these kind of methods with the performance optimizations in mind. So if you're looking for something to contribute into the Rails side, maybe consider adding dynamic finders back with performance optimized way about it. Yeah. So Ruby for developer happiness and Rails to make them smile. Moving on to the next part, why the name Ruby on Rails? So where does it came from? So when the name Rails was thought about, what DHH intended it was that Ruby as a web development, so you're using Ruby for the web development, but it is not just that. What you are being given is a guardrails with predefined opinions and choices, like a train running smoothly on the Rails. And that's why he intended to use the Rails. But then a twist to that overall naming schema is, if you look on the screen, we have Flickr, Tumblr, or Delicious, three of these websites. Now, there is something similar between these three websites and Ruby on Rails. And you might think that these websites or some part of their stack might be built with Ruby on Rails. Absolutely not. That's not the case. But there is something similar. And that similarity is all these things were named because they couldn't get the good domain name. Yeah. So Flickr, Tumblr, and Delicious, just like them, Rails.com or Rails.org was not available, which is why DHH had to think about, okay, what can I name it differently for which I have a domain available? And then Ruby on Rails.com was available and .org was available. So that's why it is named that. Now we come to one of the bigger parts. Why convention over configuration? Yeah. So this is Rails, one of the most famous and foundational principles, conventions over configurations. And to go over it, we will first understand with an example like what is convention over configuration. So in case of, let's say, active record, you have a user class and the table in the database for that becomes users. You don't define that anywhere as a, like if you're building just the Rails application, you don't necessarily need to define anywhere that my table is going to be users and my class is going to be user. You just create a class called as user and the table is automatically interpreted as something like a users. If it's not there and if you haven't configured, it will give an error. But to begin with, you have a decision made for yourself. So you don't need configurations, right? And the reason it came to that was because of the XML hell that was present back in the day in 2003 and 2004, where the developers were forced to explicitly define every single mapping in verbose and often in enormous XML files. Like there was an example that got discussed in one of such podcasts that there were examples of XML configuration files which were larger and had more number of lines of code than the working functional copy of the Basecamp entirely. So imagine what kind of a configuration files that were there. So Rails tried to flip this on its head with the core idea that the framework should make the intelligent assumptions and provide the sensible defaults, freeing the developer from specifying every mundane detail. And this convention or configuration is actually a big antidote to the notorious XML hell that was present back in the time. Now directly, so this also directly opposed the explicit is better than implicit norm that was present in that era. We still sometimes prefer having things explicitly defined and called out in our code instead of having implicit things. But when it comes to the configuration, having them more and more implicit helped out. So the next thing that we talk about is why dry? Where does it come from? Fortunately, I wasn't very sure and I couldn't find much of the things about, okay, why this was included in the first version of Rails. But then I had a quick conversation with DHH when he was here. And what he mentioned was it actually came from the book Pragmatic Programmer, which was a Dave Thomas book. And in that book, what it says is every piece of knowledge must have a single, unambiguous, and authoritative representation. And that's what the dry is. And that's why the dry got included into the Ruby on Rails as a framework. So even though it is an important, one caution that always should be taken is to not do too much of a dry, because then it leads into premature complexities within the application. Moving on to the next part, which is MVC. So why MVC? So when it comes to MVC, this was something that was a well-established pattern back in the 2003-2004 era. And then the better part of it was it perfectly aligned with the Rails conventional configuration philosophy. So this particularly eliminated need for repetitive decisions and about how to organize the code. So ended up not reinventing the wheel for the MVC pattern, and that got included. Next, why active record ORM? This is interesting because I explicitly added the ORM word there in front of the active record, because active record was until then was a name of the pattern, and this pattern was present in Martin Fowler's book. And in that book, he mentions that, the reason he decided to have the active word in front of this particular pattern or name it as an active pattern was because active was used to emphasize that the object is not passive data container. Instead, it is actively participating in its lifestyle, performing database operations directly. And that's the reason Martin Fowler called it active record. And that pattern was taken in and the ORM was built on that, and it was called as an active record. But the other contribution that this particular active record pattern did to the Rails is the naming conventions like active versus action. So everything active indicates that it's a fundamental or a data or a utility related component within the Rails application. So examples of that are active record, active support, active storage, active model, and then the action is reserved or indicates the components that handle the user interactions or the web specific processes. So on that side, we have the action controller, action view, action mailer, and action view. Yeah. Next is why omakase, right? The meaning of that word is I will leave it up to you. And there is a good blog post from 2012 that talks about this. It was written by DHH. Rails is omakase. And the constraints that we have to understand from that era, that DHH being the only person who was working on the Basecamp, he had a few other commitments for the 37 Signals other clients also. He was a full-time student at the university, and combined with that, he was spending just 10 hours a week on the Basecamp. So with the combination of all these things, he was pretty much of the mentality that he's trying to get a lot out of a little. And this resulted into Rails being more of a unique creation story, where it was more of a extracted and not built. And the result was the web framework to provide more scaffolding options and support. And that's why it ended up becoming more of a battery included approach. And it is also noteworthy that Rails was one of the first to take this approach of having the batteries included approach of building the frameworks. Next is why REST. Now, REST was being it is something that got coined in around 2000s itself, but then there is a good keynote talk from the DHH in 2006 that talks about this particular decision. So what happened was, when the Rails 2.0 came in, REST was prominently included and decided to be across the application very prominently. And some of the reasons for such architecture were simplicity and consistency. Second was discoverability, like consistent URL patterns and controller structures basically make it easier for developers to understand and work with the different Rails applications. Then better domain modeling. So this was one of the important points. So the CRUD principles and overall CRUD is something that took a lot of time in that keynote, where he explained why it is important to focus on that and spend time doing that, because this leads to the discovery of new and meaningful resources like subscriptions, membership. So it ends up aiding the good design of the entire application. And that's why the CRUD was important. And the API development is also something that gets easier. So all of that combined is why the REST becomes so much prominent and important within the Rails. Next, so here we complete all of our why stories, and now we go into more of the other stories that we have. So one of that prominent one is modularity and the Merb merger. So what Merb was a framework back in 2009, 10, 11, where it was just more of a controller stack with a rack and mongrel for web server interfaces. Mainly the rack was important. Then it also had ERB for views, data mapper for models. But the main important point about the Merb was that it was multiple components coming together and making Merb as a framework. So if you don't want to use the Merb in its entirety, you can use the components of it, and that was possible. But Rails until that point, until Rails 2.0, wasn't something like that. You use entire Rails or you don't use the Rails. So when the merger happened, the Rails 3 became more modular. It had a well-defined public APIs so that the gem developers and others who are depending on those public APIs don't have to face with any of the APIs that are getting deprecated. It also improved the performance and the scalability, and it provided a lot of upgrade lessons. So for example, you must have heard quite a many times that the application updates from 2.0 to 3.0 is something that is very, very hard, and the reason for that was this particular merger. So from this point onwards, it became much more possible to use multiple components within the Rails independently as well. So for example, the previous talk we saw, where the validators is something that you could take out from the Rails and use independently. So things like that are pretty much possible with all of the things that are there in the Rails. Next is a story of a strong parameters. So I would say this is one of my favorite stories. So we will start what happened on 4th March 2012, wherein a developer from Russia called this Homakov created this commit on Rails repository on GitHub, and it was created from the DHH's account. So what happened there was he was trying to convey some of the issues or security issues that he was finding in the Rails applications, but then whatever that he was communicating wasn't taken seriously, and he had to prove a point that these are valid concerns. So what he did was, on the Rails main repository in the main branch, he created a commit, and he added some comments from the DHS's account as well on this particular PR, saying that, whoa, how can I commit in master? And then this issue got very much talked upon. A lot of Rails applications back then had to immediately get updated to fix this issue, wherein the mass assignment was the problem. So what was happening in the mass assignment is, here is an example where you have a user.new, you are taking certain parameters and you're saving them. But then if you look at the parameters hash, it could be anything. If this particular user has, let's say, a role ID or is admin true false, then I can pass in the parameters is admin true, and then it will get updated and I get an admin access, right? So that's the problem. And the way it got resolved was using the strong parameters, wherein when you're calling user.create and passing the parameters to it, you need to mention which parameters are permitted for this particular action. And if there are any other parameters like isAdmin, then those will get rejected. So that was the idea. So we'll quickly also look at the days before the bundler. So quick note about like what was there in the Rails 1, which was all plugins. Rails 2 had the first class support for the plugins as a gems. Rails 2 also added dependency on a rack, and then the tools that were being used was something like a gem cutter. So here is a quick example wherein we have environment.rb and a config.gem files. So environment.rb is specifying the Rails gem version, which is 2.3.11. And if you look at the config.gem, there are multiple gems and the versions that are mentioned in front of you. So you will also see that some of the gems are coming from the gems.github.com. So it used to be specification of the gems like this without having any gem file or gemfile.log, and then you need to install that with the rake gems install. And if you have a 2-3 applications on the same machine with different Ruby versions or even the different gem versions, it used to be a hell to fix that and get multiple applications running on your machine. So all of that gets solved when the bundler came into the picture, which provided the per application dependency resolution. It provided with the gemfile and gemfile.log to manage the dependencies correctly. Just a quick note from back in those days when there was one suggestion that I had provided for adding the version numbers into the bundler, which got implemented. So for example, what we have here is fetching SAS 3.7.7 was 3.5.7. So this particular notification got added to indicate whether it was a major version upgrade or a minor version upgrade. And then coming to the other stories from the last RailsConf, I would say last meaning this RailsConf, there are a couple of other talks that are talking about other areas of Rails and from the point of view of historical features and evolution of them. So I decided not to include them. So there are certain talks that are focusing on the front end, then certain that are focusing on the deployment side, certain that are about the background jobs, and then Rails features, which ones we loved, which ones we lost and laughed at. So overall, what's the conclusion? I would say overall, this is how the overall picture from 2005 to 15 and from 15 to 25 looks like, where if you see in 2005, there were just about 6 core elements that were present. In the second picture, if you see, at least 4 new got added into it. And then in the last 10 years, even more got added into Rails. And lastly, we will quickly just look at some of the nostalgia from the past. So this used to be the first website for the Ruby on Rails. Agile web development with Rails was kind of the only book back then, 2009 when I started. This used to be how API documentation used to look like. It worked, but yeah, just that, nothing else. RailsCast, this was very, very popular back then. A lot of people will have a very fond memories of listening to Ryan Bates on the RailsCast. Yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.